Peer support happens all the time. When we go to a neighbor, when we go to a friend, when we're having a tough time, when we go to somebody who can totally relate to what's going on with us, when we actually become vulnerable enough to share a situation, an experience, and when we then participate in being there for others through their hard times because we can relate. That's all it is, really. We've all experienced that. So with that, we want to think about what's the actual intention. Someone said they were curious about the intentional part of peer support. And I think that that's a really important component, because if you don't have some kind of purpose, some kind of intention behind what it is that you're trying to do, it can be really easy to get stuck in the shared experience of illness or the shared experience of whatever difficulty, and then stay stuck in that role and that kind of relationship where all you focus on is illness. So intentional to me means that first of all, we build a connection. First of all, we commit to opening ourselves to another human being or other human beings in a profound way. And in that connection, we have a purpose. We have the purpose of moving beyond where we are right now. We're using this connection, we're using this relationship to explore new possibilities. We're challenging and pushing and supporting and acknowledging one another. And so consequently, both of us are in a learning experience. Out of this comes the possibility that perhaps we can see things in new ways. I don't know about other people in the room, but for the longest time, I was so stuck in thinking that I was incapacitated, that I would always need professional help, that things would never really get better, because I didn't have a framework for possibilities. I didn't have anyone sort of pushing me and challenging me. And I think that when we have the intention of growing together, we build a very productive kind of relationship. And I began to think that distinguishing what we were doing from other kinds of help was really important. So Erie and others of us and myself began to think that there were some fundamental differences in what it is that we were trying to do. And to summarize them, I think you've got the right slide. Rather than focusing on helping, we changed our focus to learning together, and I'll talk more about that. When we started to try to help each other, we ended up stuck in a sort of a problem-oriented story often. Focusing on learning together creates a whole different context, and again, we'll talk about that. Another difference is that rather than focusing on just the individual in need, we focus on the relationship and all of the benefits and characteristics of a relationship that's mutually empowering. Finally, and these are sort of the overlays that we'll use today to explain everything else. It's been really important to me, particularly working in crisis, that we consider the fact that much of mental health is very reactive. It's been very fear-based, very risk-oriented, which is fair. We get scared. We want to have some ideas of what to do, and so we react. However, so much has become fear-based that some of us have even become afraid of our own feelings. We've become afraid to have intense feelings. And I think that in and of itself is imprisoning, really. So we'd like to propose that relationships that are hope-based, that create possibility, is a way of thinking about risk that says sort of implicitly that if you don't take a risk, there will be problems. So before we get off on that too far, it's important also to make sure that we don't throw things out that are important. We don't want to throw the concept of help out the window. What we want to be able to do is redefine help so that it's mutually profitable, really. Helping isn't the enemy. It just is a different focus with learning. So we decided that in order to keep you awake this afternoon, we'd have a couple of exercises. And I hope that that you feel comfortable enough to respond, and will, and if you don't, just share what you want to share. The first question is, for some of us, help has been a lifelong sentence. So I'm curious to know for yourselves, what is it like being told that you'll always need help? Does anybody remember that being told that they'll always need help? And I think that the question that I'm hoping to really look at today is, how can we be helpful in new ways so that we don't put across the idea that people will need professional help for their whole lives? And for many of us, let me just ask this quickly. How many of you sort of fall naturally into a caretaking or fixing or helping role, just sort of by your nature? It's a common, many people just learn to live their lives that way. So for those of us who have been in or easily fall into being a helper, being sort of the dominant helper in a relationship, what happens to your relationships when you're always the person helping? What happens in the relationship? What you want to do is to build up relationships where there's some sense of resentment because you're feeling burdened. So bringing it back to the relationship and the focus on learning allows for you to have some freedom in the relationship as well as some opportunity. Thank you. So is anybody able to describe a really positive helping relationship? Think of a time when you were in distress of some kind and someone offered their support, whatever you want to call it, and it was really, you kept your feet on the ground and you kept, both people took responsibility for the relationship. That's so powerful, because often when we've been in the receiving end of help, we feel indebted and we feel like we want to return the favor. I would just caution us to begin to think that sometimes it's easy to go extremely the other way. So if you've been on the receiving end of help for a long, long time, to begin to help somebody else or others feels really terrific. So it becomes easy then to get stuck in just being the helper and not having some sense of mutuality. Just to summarize, if we begin to think about learning versus help, we can think, we can begin to create possibilities. Help assumes that there's a problem to be solved often. I can share a story with you. When, gosh, it went right out of my head.
Good.
Yeah. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Good, it came back. I'm so grateful for these moments. When we were running this peer-run crisis alternative, which is still in existence, it was very interesting because people came in and were receiving support, getting support from their peers and colleagues. And when folks felt like they had done a good job, when they had gotten through a rough time with that person, they felt pretty good about themselves, as giving support to someone does feel good. However, when the next person came on the shift and there was sort of nothing there to talk about, they felt like they weren't doing a good job. So in fact, in this case, the notion and the role and the job description of help meant solving somebody else's problems. When there are no problems to be solved, we tend to go looking for problems to be solved. So learning is not this, learning together, building mutual growth and learning is not the same as just skill building. Learning is that wonderful feeling that you get when you have an intense or interesting conversation with somebody you have something in common with, and something new occurs to you, an idea happens, or a light bulb goes off for you, which is quite different than simply learning a skill. So I like to think that in those light bulb moments, there's something that happens, something that we can actually capture. Can we imagine, for example, measuring, evaluating the extent to which light bulb moments occur and what they produce? So we get back to another exercise on learning relationships and thinking about the kinds of relationships that produce those moments. And I wanted to share a short story with you and then ask you to think of some of your own stories. Years ago, when I was inpatient in hospital for long periods of time, I'd often end up losing custody of my children for that time. And it felt really awful. That was one of the most terrifying things that ever happened to me. And so this one time, I'd been in this same hospital a couple of times and had gotten familiar with the staff as well as just people in the community. And I had just been told I'd lost custody. It was holiday time, and I was really upset, and I was banging on the door and wanting to get out of the hospital. And this nurse that I knew quite well came up to me and basically picked me up by the scruff of the neck and said, "Sherry, what's it going to be? Are you going to be a chronic mental patient, or are you going to be a social worker?" I had been in social work school at the time. And up to that point in my life, I didn't know I had a choice. And for me, that was such a learning opportunity because she took a risk with me. She took a risk because she believed in me and saw the possibility. So she opened up a new world, a new story for me that just hadn't existed before. So just for a couple of seconds, we don't have lots of time to spend on all of this, but it would be useful for you to just think of a few qualities of learning relationships that you've had, relationships that spark that sense of growth, that sense of excitement, that sense of new life and possibility and zest for both people. And just begin to think of the qualities and give yourselves a couple of seconds to think about these, maybe write down a couple of things and come back and we'll share some of those. They can be all kinds of relationships that we learn from it. It doesn't have to be somebody with a lot in common. It can just be somebody who's just at that moment right there for you or with you. And that's really powerful. In light of the kind of time that we have, I'm not going to go further with that. But just as you think about this stuff, as we talk about this today, think about those relationships that you have in your lives that are really growth-filled relationships. I don't have great language for this yet, so I keep coming back to the same words. But I think you know what it means, and I think you've had these inspiring kinds of relationships. Second overlay, the second really differing principle for me is this notion that we focus on the relationship versus just on the individual. And that has all kinds of connotations to it. When we focus on the individual, only one person in the relationship really has to work at it and work on changes. And I think that we've often made the mistake of thinking that the growth of the person is the only thing to be measuring. And we forget to look at the relational dynamics that contribute to growth. And so focusing on the relationships that we have actually produce even better individual outcomes, if that makes sense. And when we focus on the individual, we often come into that helping focus with predetermined outcomes. In other words, we want to be able to see the results that we hope for, and then we'll know that we've helped. In a focus on the relationship, when you go in to have a conversation with a community member, or you go in and have a conversation with a peer or a colleague, you don't know what's going to come out of it. It's sort of unpredictable. But you hope, and out of that hope comes all kinds of, again, with all kinds of possibilities. And the other thing about looking at relationships as opposed to just focusing on the individual is that we get to begin to think about some of the relational dynamics that we get into. The woman up here was speaking about feeling burdened when she became just the helper. And I think that's a really good statement because many of us have ended up in that kind of position. When we pay attention to what's going on between us, what it is that we're both contributing to a relationship, we both have to put energy into it. We have to look at the dynamics that we get stuck in and do something about it. Because one person can't change another. And I know you all know that from experience. And most importantly, when we pay attention to relationships, when we pay attention to the dynamics and successful relationships, the ones that you identified earlier, the qualities in earlier, then we can begin to see how that snowballs, how one relationship that's successful, one mutual relationship, impacts the next relationship because you come in with confidence and you come in with an idea that each relationship has to have some notion of mutuality to be successful. And I think, again, in terms of measurement, it would be a very interesting study to consider how helping or learning or this new kind of relationship has influenced other relationships in people's lives. The third overlay is this notion of hope-based relationships versus fear-based relationships. I was saying earlier that fear-based relationships are often about risk and liability. And we've built lots of our mental health system around that fear base. It's been about protecting people, protecting the community, and we define good practice by sort of predictable outcomes, if you will. And I think one of the things that it does is it gives us a sense of control, a feeling of control. When something feels very out of control and we're afraid, we tend to react by taking control. The other concept, I think, in building hope-based relationships is that they are unpredictable. There's not a predetermined outcome. And you have to learn to sit with some level of discomfort. When you get afraid and you want to take control, often that's about our own discomfort. And so part of a hope-based relationship is tolerating sort of greater levels of discomfort, being able to sit with more of your own anxiety perhaps, and just sitting with that rather than taking control. I think I'll take a little bit of a break there and ask if there are any questions at this time, because what we'll go into next is the practice of these principles, how we actually teach and learn and think about these principles.